May 17, 1944. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the modest town of Garden Grove, California. A convoy of olive green trucks rolled down Main Street, their canvas covers concealing what most residents had only whispered about in recent weeks. Inside one truck, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Reinhardt pressed his face against a small opening, watching palm trees drift past like sentinels of some alien world. The air tasted different here, sweet with citrus blossoms, thick with warmth that bore no resemblance to the acrid smoke of North Africa, where British artillery had ended his war 3 months prior. He could hear the breathing of 30 other men packed shoulder to shoulder in the darkness, each lost in their own thoughts, each carrying the weight of Nazi propaganda that had prepared them for torture, starvation, perhaps execution. None of them were prepared for what awaited them in America. The trucks came to a halt outside Camp Ruston's newest satellite facility. When the canvas covers were pulled back, late spring light flooded in, and with it came the first shock. American guards stood relaxed, rifles slung over shoulders rather than pointed at chests. One of them, a young private who could not have been older than 19, offered his hand to help prisoners down from the truck bed. Klaus stared at the extended palm, as though it were a weapon he did not recognize. In 4 years of Wehrmacht service, surrender had always meant humiliation. Yet here stood an enemy soldier, his expression neither hateful nor triumphant, merely indifferent, perhaps even bored. The moment held significance that transcended a simple gesture of courtesy. For these men, warriors of the Third Reich who had fought across 2 continents, who had witnessed the full fury of modern warfare, who had been told since childhood that democracy bred weakness, and that America was a nation rotting from racial impurity and Jewish influence, for them, this extended hand represented the first crack in an ideological foundation that had seemed unshakable. But they did not know that yet. They could not have known that the greatest battle they would fight on American soil would not be against their captors, but against everything they had been taught to believe. The story of German prisoners of war in the United States remains one of World War II's most overlooked chapters. Between 1943 and 1946, some 425,000 German soldiers crossed the Atlantic Ocean not as conquerors, but as captives distributed across 700 camps spanning from the humid lowlands of Louisiana to the wheat fields of Kansas, from the desert expanses of Arizona to the forested valleys of Wisconsin. They came in waves, U-boat crews plucked from Atlantic waters, Afrika Korps veterans captured in Tunisia, Wehrmacht infantry from the Italian campaign, and later, after D-Day, thousands upon thousands more from France and Germany itself. The first arrivals came in late 1942, but the flood truly began in 1943, when Liberty ships returning empty from Europe began filling their holds with prisoners rather than sailing home with useless ballast. By May 1945, at the program's peak, 371,683 Germans and thousands more Italians and Japanese inhabited what amounted to a hidden nation within America's borders. Most Americans knew nothing of this parallel universe. Government censors kept newspaper coverage minimal, partly to comply with the Geneva Convention's restrictions on exploiting prisoners for propaganda purposes, partly to avoid civilian panic at housing so many enemy soldiers on home soil. The camps were deliberately positioned away from cities, away from defense factories, away from the strategic arteries of American war production. Yet they were not hidden in the way concentration camps were hidden. They existed in plain sight, and in some communities, German prisoners became as familiar as the mailman walking in work details to local farms, visible behind chain-link fences that seemed almost apologetic in their construction. The paradox of their captivity lay precisely in this tension. They were enemies held in a nation at total war, yet they lived better than they had lived as free men in Germany. But in those first hours after arrival, none of that mattered to Klaus Reinhardt and his fellow prisoners. They stood in formation in the dusty assembly area, awaiting whatever came next. What came next was processing. American efficiency, they would learn, meant forms and paperwork and meticulous record-keeping. Each man surrendered his remaining personal effects, watches, rings, photographs, and most importantly, any currency. The Geneva Convention mandated this confiscation, ostensibly to prevent escape attempts, though the irony would not become apparent until later. They received in exchange a receipt promising return of all items upon repatriation. Then came the medical inspection, conducted by Army doctors who worked with brisk professionalism, checking for disease, malnutrition, injuries that require treatment. Many prisoners tensed during this examination, memories of SS medical experiments and Nazi racial hygiene theories making them suspect American doctors might seek revenge. Instead, they found physicians who treated infections, prescribed medications, and worked to restore weight to men who had arrived malnourished from months in British holding camps. The absurdity struck Klaus during his examination. Here stood a Jewish-American doctor. The Star of David hanging from a chain around his neck left no doubt, gently probing a wound on Klaus's shoulder from shrapnel that had not fully healed. The doctor spoke in accented but fluent German, asking about pain levels, range of motion, when the injury had occurred. This was the Untermensch that Goebbels had railed against in 1,000 speeches? This professional, this healer who showed more concern for Klaus's well-being than most Wehrmacht doctors had shown their own men? The cognitive dissonance planted a seed of doubt, though Klaus pushed it down, uncomfortable with where such thoughts might lead. After processing came assignment to barracks. The structures themselves presented another shock, wooden buildings that resembled standard military housing, neither luxurious nor punishing, simply functional. 40 square feet per enlisted man, as the Geneva Convention required, the same space allotted to American soldiers. Each barack contained rows of simple beds with thin mattresses, metal frames, wool blankets. No chains, no bars on the windows, no cells. Men who had prepared themselves for dungeons found themselves in what amounted to basic training facilities. Watchtowers stood at regular intervals around the camp perimeter, yes, and barbed wire marked the boundaries clearly, but the overall impression was less prison than military installation. Some prisoners, particularly those from the Afrika Korps who had been captured early in 1943 during the Tunisia campaign, treated this with suspicion. They had left Germany when the Reich still seemed invincible, when Stalingrad had not yet fallen, when the tide had not yet turned. They maintained discipline according to Wehrmacht regulations, organized themselves into command structures, and waited for the American facade to crack and reveal the brutality they expected must lie beneath. Nothing prepared them for the American mess line. Klaus watched in stunned silence as the first prisoners moved through, receiving portions that seemed to violate the laws of nature. A thick slice of roast beef, steam rising from its surface, the smell of it filling the hall with such richness that several men stopped walking, unable to process what they were seeing. Mashed potatoes, a scoop, so large it overflowed the section of the tray. Green beans glistening with butter, actual butter, not margarine or lard. A piece of white bread, soft and fresh, and beside it another portion they initially could not identify until someone whispered, apple pie. For dessert. Fresh baked apple pie with a flaky crust and cinnamon-sweet filling that looked like something from a memory of childhood before the war, before rationing, before austerity became a virtue. Klaus carried his tray to a long table and sat without speaking. Around him, 30 men faced the same crisis of comprehension. This was the ration for prisoners. For enemy combatants? The Geneva Convention required that prisoners receive food equivalent to what the captors' soldiers ate, but surely this could not be standard military fare. Surely this was some kind of propaganda exercise, a show put on for the Red Cross inspectors they had seen in the processing area. Tomorrow would bring the real rations, thin soup and black bread, what their captors truly thought they deserved. Klaus cut a piece of the roast beef with the dull knife provided. The meat was tender, properly cooked, seasoned with salt and pepper. He placed it in his mouth and chewed slowly. The flavor exploded across his tongue, rich, fatty, satisfying in a way that made his eyes water. He had not tasted beef this good since before the war. Even on leave in Germany, even in officers' messes, meat this quality had been rare. And here it sat on a prisoner's tray in a camp in the middle of nowhere in California. Franz Becker, sitting across from Klaus, stared at his plate without eating. Franz had fought in Poland, in France, in Russia before being transferred to North Africa. He had seen the inside of Wehrmacht field kitchens, knew exactly what rations looked like when an army controlled half of Europe. This exceeded anything he had experienced. "I don't understand," Franz finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are they feeding us like this?" No one answered, because no one had an answer. They ate in near silence, the only sounds a scraping of forks on metal trays and occasional murmurs of disbelief. Some men cleaned their plates completely. Others, overwhelmed, left food uneaten, not from distaste but from an inability to process what this abundance meant. For years, Nazi propaganda had told them that America was on the brink of collapse. The Americans were soft, pampered, unable to make the sacrifices that total war demanded. Their economy was controlled by Jewish financiers who cared nothing for the common people. Their mongrel population lacked the racial purity necessary for true strength. They produced nothing but Hollywood fantasies and jazz music. They could never sustain a war effort against the industrial might of the Reich. Yet here was evidence that contradicted every syllable of that indoctrination. If America could afford to feed its prisoners, its enemies, portions like this, what did that say about its productive capacity? If this was how they treated captives, what abundance must exist outside these fences? The questions hung in the air like smoke, uncomfortable and unavoidable. After dinner, as they returned to their barracks in the fading California twilight, Klaus noticed something else that deepened the mystery. The American guards ate from the same kitchen. The same roast beef. The same mashed potatoes. The same apple pie. This was not a special showing. This was simply how Americans ate. Every day. As routine. The realization settled over the prisoners like a weight. They had been prepared for cruelty and found courtesy. They had been prepared for starvation and found abundance. They had been prepared for everything except this fundamental appending of the narrative that had sustained them through years of war. Over the following days and weeks, the pattern continued. Breakfast brought eggs, actual eggs, not powdered substitutes, bacon, toast, butter, jam, orange juice. Lunch might be sandwiches thick with ham or chicken, potato salad, fresh vegetables, cookies. Dinner varied but maintained the same generous portions, pork chops one night, fried chicken next, occasionally fish, always with sides and desserts. The caloric count exceeded 3,000 per day, equivalent to what American combat soldiers received, more than most Wehrmacht troops had eaten at the war's height. Some prisoners, coming from months of reduced rations, initially struggled to eat such quantities. Their bodies, adapted to scarcity, protested against plenty. Within weeks, however, the transformation became visible. Hollow cheeks filled out. Sunken eyes brightened. Men who had arrived gaunt began to develop the first signs of actual fat, a condition so novel that it became a subject of dark humor. One prisoner later testified that he gained 57 pounds during his first 2 years in American captivity, going from 128 pounds to 185 pounds. After 2 years as an American POW, I weighed 185, he recalled. I had gotten so fat you could no longer see my eyes. But the food represented only the first layer of abundance. As Klaus and his fellow prisoners settled into the camp routine, they discovered privileges and comforts that seemed to violate every principle of wartime captivity they had internalized. They received regular allotments of cigarettes, real tobacco, American cigarettes, not the harsh substitutes that had circulated in Germany. They could purchase additional items at the camp canteen, candy bars, Coca-Cola, writing paper, toiletries, magazines. They were paid for their labor when assigned to work details, 80 cents per day for enlisted men, wages deposited in accounts they could access for canteen purchases or save for repatriation. The camp library, stocked with thousands of books including works that had been banned in Nazi Germany, was open to all. Prisoners organized theatrical productions, musical performances, sports leagues. They could write letters home, receive packages, attend religious services. Some camps even allowed prisoners to keep small gardens where they could grow vegetables and flowers. The work details, initially viewed with suspicion, presented their own revelations. In accordance with the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be required to work, but not in any capacity that directly supported the war effort. Most found themselves assigned to agricultural labor, addressing the severe shortage of farm workers as millions of American men served overseas. Each morning, trucks carried prisoners to orchards and fields across the region. The quota, 36 boxes of oranges per day, for example, was reasonable, achievable. Men who completed their assignments early could return to camp. Those who worked slowly or refused faced punishment, but punishment meant confinement with bread and water rations, not beatings or torture. The absurdity of it struck many prisoners. They were enemy soldiers working American farms, often without guards, operating on an honor system that would have been unthinkable in Germany. The liberation of the concentration camps in 1945 added another dimension to the prisoners' transformation. American authorities forced German POWs to watch footage of Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, the skeletal prisoners, the mass graves, the industrial machinery of death. The films were met with shock, anger, disbelief. Many prisoners initially refused to accept the footage as real, calling them bone films and insisting they were propaganda fakes. But others recognized the truth. They had known concentration camps existed. That had never been entirely secret. But the scale, the systematic nature, the sheer evil of it shocked even those who had served the regime faithfully. The contrast became unbearable. They had been fed roast beef and shown movies while their government operated death factories. They had been treated with dignity while their nation committed genocide. The moral ledger was so unbalanced that reconciliation seemed impossible. Klaus watched those films in a camp theater in May 1945, shortly after Germany's surrender. He sat in stunned silence as the footage rolled, bulldozers pushing piles of emaciated corpses into mass graves, survivors who looked like animated skeletons, the efficient cruelty of it all documented in black and white clarity. He had not known. That was his first thought. He had not known the camps were like that. But even as he thought it, doubt crept in. Had he really not known? Or had he chosen not to know, not to ask questions, not to think too carefully about where the Jews went after deportation, not to wonder why entire populations simply vanished? Ignorance was a defense, but was it an honest one? The film offered no answers, only evidence of monstrous crime committed in Germany's name. When the lights came up, the theater was silent. Some prisoners wept. Others sat stone-faced. A few whispered denials. But something had shifted, fundamentally and irrevocably. The combination of American abundance and Nazi atrocity completed the ideological transformation for many prisoners. They had come to America believing in German superiority, in the rightness of their cause, in the necessity of their struggle. They left having seen two truths. Their enemies were more civilized than they had imagined, and their own nation was more barbaric than they had believed possible. The space between those truths was where democracy planted roots. Not through lectures or propaganda, but through lived experience. Not by telling Germans how to think, but by showing them alternatives and allowing them to reach their own conclusions. When Klaus finally boarded the ship that would take him from America to France in December 1945, he stood on the deck and watched the California coast recede. 2 years of his life spent as a prisoner in a foreign land. 2 years that had transformed him more profoundly than 4 years of war had done. He thought about the grocery store, about the oranges, about the roast beef dinners and the white bread, and the casual abundance that had seemed so impossible. He thought about Private Morrison from Nebraska, about the Jewish doctor who had treated his wound, about the farmers who had shared lunches with their prisoner workers. He thought about Remark and Man and the banned books he had read, about the movies and music and ideas that had been forbidden in Germany. He thought about the grocery store one more time, about standing before those shelves and feeling his worldview collapse. And he understood that America had won the war before a single shot was fired, had won it in factories and farms, in grocery stores and mess halls, in the everyday abundance that democracy generated and dictatorship could never match. The ship pulled away from the dock, carrying hundreds of German prisoners back toward a ruined homeland and an uncertain future. Klaus turned his back on America and faced east toward the life that waited. He carried with him a few $100s, some English language skills, and something more valuable than both: the knowledge that another way was possible. That nations did not need dictators to be strong. That people did not need to be molded into a master race to achieve greatness. That freedom produced prosperity, and prosperity enabled generosity, and generosity, extended even to enemies, might be the ultimate expression of strength. These were not lessons that would rebuild Germany's shattered cities, would not restore the dead to life, would not erase the crimes committed in the nation's name. But they were lessons that might, perhaps, help prevent it from happening again. In the end, the story of German prisoners of war in America is a story about the power of abundance to transform ideology. Food, in its most literal sense, became the weapon that defeated fascism more thoroughly than bombs ever could. Because you cannot maintain belief in scarcity-based nationalism when confronted with post-scarcity reality. You cannot preach racial superiority when your supposed inferiors demonstrate material superiority. You cannot sustain totalitarian control when people see that freedom generates better outcomes. The grocery store in Garden Grove, California, and hundreds of places like it across America, accomplished what battlefield victory alone could never achieve. They revealed the fundamental bankruptcy of Nazi ideology by demonstrating the abundance that democracy created. Klaus Reinhardt lived until 1993, dying at age 73 in a comfortable house in what was by then the Federal Republic of Germany, a prosperous democracy that would have seemed impossible in 1946. He never returned to America, though he sometimes spoke of visiting. In his final years, when his grandchildren asked about the war, he told them again about the oranges. About standing in that store, a prisoner in a foreign land, and seeing the future. About understanding, In that moment of profound cognitive dissonance, that everything he had been taught was a lie, and everything he had fought for was ash. About learning that freedom and abundance were not weakness but strength, that democracy was not chaos but possibility, that treating people with dignity, even enemies, was not mercy but wisdom. The oranges, he would say. Remember the oranges. They were unlimited, and that changed everything. The lesson echoes across decades. True strength is measured not by what a nation can hoard, but by what it can produce, not by what it can deny its enemies, but by what it can afford to give them, not by the purity of its ideology, but by the prosperity of its people. The German prisoners who walked into American supermarkets and could not believe food was unlimited learned a truth that transcends their moment in history. Abundance, freely shared, is the ultimate expression of power. And freedom, for all its messiness and contradictions, remains humanity's most effective generator of that abundance. The shelves were full. The prisoners were fed. And in those simple facts lay the death of an empire and the birth of understanding.